My parents said I was too ugly to marry. Then their chosen son-in-law begged for my signature. My name is Sarah, I am 32, and I live in Columbus, Ohio. This is the story of how my own parents told me I was too ugly to marry, only for their perfect future son-in-law to end up on his knees, begging me for my signature. Growing up in a middle-class suburb of Columbus, I learned early that my sister Jessica was the sun in our family's solar system, and I was somewhere out there in the cold darkness of Pluto. Jessica was 3 years younger than me, blessed with what my mother called natural beauty, blonde hair that caught the light just right, blue eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and the kind of effortless charm that made everyone gravitate toward her. Me? I had what my mother diplomatically referred to as character. Brown hair that never quite cooperated, glasses that seemed perpetually crooked, and a tendency to prefer books over parties. While Jessica was crowned homecoming queen and dated the quarterback, I was in the library tutoring struggling students, in math and spending my weekends at debate tournaments. The comparisons started early and never stopped. Sarah, honey, why don't you try a little makeup like your sister? Sarah, maybe if you smiled more like Jessica. Sarah, you know, personality is important, but first impressions matter too. By the time I graduated high school, I'd internalized every subtle dig and outright comparison. I wasn't the pretty one, the social one, or the one who made our parents beam with pride at neighborhood barbecues. I was just Sarah, the reliable one, the smart one, the one who'd probably find someone, eventually, if I was lucky. Ohio State University was my escape hatch. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued intelligence over appearance, who engaged in passionate debates about literature and philosophy rather than discussing the latest gossip. I threw myself into my studies, majoring in business law with a minor in intellectual property. It was there that I met Professor Martinez, a brilliant woman who specialized in patent law. She saw something in me that my family never had: potential. Under her mentorship, I discovered I had a natural talent for understanding complex legal frameworks and identifying loopholes that others missed. Sarah, she told me during my junior year, you have a gift. You see patterns where others see chaos. That's going to serve you well in the real world. Meanwhile, back home, Jessica had dropped out of community college after 2 semesters to focus on her modeling career, which mostly consisted of local mall fashion shows and a few small-town beauty pageants. But she was happy, and more importantly, she made our parents happy. Every family gathering was filled with stories of Jessica's latest photo shoot, or her growing Instagram following. I graduated summa cum laude and landed a position at a mid-sized intellectual property firm in downtown Columbus. It wasn't glamorous, but I was doing work I loved, helping inventors protect their innovations and navigating the complex world of patents and trademarks. Jessica was 25 when she met Brandon Hartwell at a charity golf tournament. Brandon was everything our parents had dreamed of in a son-in-law: handsome, charming, from a wealthy family that owned several car dealerships across central Ohio. He drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, and had the kind of confident smile that made my mother practically swoon. "Oh, Sarah," my mother gushed during one of our increasingly rare family dinners. "You should see how he looks at Jessica, like she's the only woman in the world. And his family, they're so successful. Brandon's father owns 5 dealerships, and Brandon is being groomed to take over the business." My father nodded approvingly. "Good stock, good family. Jessica's done well for herself." I sat there, picking at my pot roast, listening to them plan Jessica's future like she was a prized thoroughbred being matched with an equally impressive stallion. When the conversation briefly turned to my work, a complex patent case I was working on for a tech startup, their eyes glazed over within minutes. "That's nice, dear," my mother said absently. "But when are you going to focus on finding someone? You're not getting any younger, and frankly..." She let the sentence hang in the air like a sword of Damocles. The engagement party was held at the country club, a lavish affair with white roses, champagne fountains, and a guest list that read like a who's who of Columbus society. I stood in the corner in my best dress, a conservative navy blue number that my mother had grudgingly approved of, watching Jessica float around the room like a fairy tale princess. Brandon seemed perfect. He was attentive to Jessica, charming to the guests, and respectful to my parents. He even made an effort to talk to me, though I could see the polite disinterest in his eyes when I mentioned my work. "Patent law, huh?" he said, sipping his champagne. "That sounds complicated." "It can be," I replied. "But it's fascinating. I'm actually working on a case right now involving automotive technology. New safety innovations that could revolutionize—" "Excuse me," he interrupted smoothly. "I think Jessica's looking for me." I watched him walk away, and something inside me withered just a little bit more. The breaking point came 6 months before Jessica's wedding. We were having our traditional family Sunday dinner, and the conversation had inevitably turned to wedding planning. The dress, the flowers, the catering, every detail dissected and celebrated. I had just received news that morning about a major victory in a patent case I'd been working on for over a year. My client, a small automotive parts manufacturer, had been fighting a patent infringement claim from a major corporation. Through meticulous research and creative legal arguments, I'd not only gotten the case dismissed, but had helped my client file their own counterclaim. It was the kind of victory that would make my career, and I was bursting to share it with someone. "I have some exciting news too," I said during a lull in the wedding talk. "Remember that big case I've been working on? Well, we won, and—" My mother held up her hand. "Sarah, honey, can we talk about your work later? We're trying to finalize the seating arrangements, and it's really important." I felt my cheeks burn, but I pressed on. "It'll just take a minute. This could really change things for me professionally. Sarah." My father's voice had that edge it got when he was losing patience. "Not everything is about you. This is Jessica's time." That's when my mother dropped the bomb that would change everything. "Speaking of seating arrangements," she said, turning to Jessica, "I think we should put Sarah at the back table with your great-aunt Millie and the cousins from Toledo. Honestly, with all these attractive couples coming, we don't want her to, well, you know, stick out." Jessica giggled. "Mom, that's terrible." But my mother wasn't done. She turned to me with that smile she used when she was about to deliver what she considered helpful advice. "Sarah, dear, I think it's time we had a frank conversation. You're 32 now, and while your career is nice, you need to be realistic about your prospects. You're not getting any younger, and frankly, you're just not, well, you don't have Jessica's natural advantages." The room went silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "What exactly are you saying, Mom?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She sighed, as if explaining something to a particularly slow child. "I'm saying that maybe it's time to accept that marriage might not be in the cards for you. You're too plain, honey. And at your age, with your personality, well, let's just say you're not exactly what men are looking for. You're too serious, too focused on that job of yours. Men want someone fun, someone beautiful, someone who makes them feel good about themselves." My father nodded along. "Your mother's right, Sarah. You've always been the practical one. Maybe it's time to focus on being the best aunt you can be instead of chasing something that's just not going to happen." The words hit me like physical blows. I sat there, staring at these people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, who had just casually destroyed whatever self-worth I had left. Jessica looked uncomfortable, but didn't say anything to defend me. Brandon, who had arrived just in time to hear the tail end of the conversation, shifted awkwardly in his chair. "I should go," I said, standing up on shaking legs. "Oh, don't be dramatic," my mother called after me as I headed for the door. "We're just being honest. Someone needs to tell you these things. I drove home to my apartment in a haze of hurt and humiliation. That night, I cried harder than I had since I was a child. But somewhere between the tears and the rage, something else began to grow. A cold, calculating determination. They thought I was too ugly to marry? Too plain to matter? We'd see about that. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I'd never experienced before. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Really. Looked and made a decision. I wasn't going to change who I was to please them, but I was going to become the absolute best version of myself. I started small. A new haircut that actually flattered my face shape. Contact lenses to replace my thick glasses. A few sessions. With a personal shopper who helped me find clothes that fit properly and made me feel confident. But the real transformation was happening inside. At work, I threw myself into my cases with renewed vigor. I started taking on more challenging clients, building a reputation as the lawyer you called when everyone else said your case was impossible. I networked aggressively, joined professional organizations, and began writing articles for legal journals. Within 6 months, I was promoted to senior associate. Within a year, I was being courted by larger firms, but I had bigger plans. Using my savings and a small business loan, I opened my own practice specializing in intellectual property law. I rented a modest office downtown and hired one assistant, but I was determined to build something significant. My first major break came when I was contacted by a small automotive startup called Innovate Drive. They had developed a revolutionary, new safety system for electric vehicles, but they were being sued by a major corporation that claimed patent infringement. The case was exactly the kind of David versus Goliath battle I lived for. The opposing legal team was massive, well-funded, and had never lost a case like this. Everyone told my client to settle. Everyone except me. I spent months researching, traveling to patent offices, interviewing engineers, and building an airtight case. What I discovered was that not only was my client innocent of infringement, but the major corporation had actually stolen their technology through corporate espionage. The trial was a media sensation. Here was this small startup, represented by a solo practitioner from Columbus, taking on one of the biggest automotive corporations in the world. The underdog story captured national attention. When the jury returned a verdict in our favor, awarding my client $50 million in damages, my phone didn't stop ringing for weeks. Suddenly, everyone wanted to hire the lawyer who had taken down the giant. But the best part? The technology my client had developed was now worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and as part of my fee agreement, I had taken a small equity stake in the company. Overnight, I went from struggling small-town lawyer to millionaire patent attorney. Success was sweet, but it wasn't enough. I wanted my family to see what they had, dismissed so casually. I wanted them to understand exactly what they had underestimated. I started making strategic moves. I bought a beautiful condo in the best neighborhood in Columbus, complete with a view of the Scioto River. I drove a sleek Tesla Model S. I wore designer suits that cost more than my father made in a month, but I kept my distance from family gatherings. When they invited me to Jessica's bridal shower, I politely declined, citing work commitments. When they called to ask why I'd missed another Sunday dinner, I told them I was traveling for business. The truth was, I was busy building an empire. My law firm was growing rapidly. I had hired 5 associates and support staff, and we were handling some of the most significant intellectual property cases in the Midwest. But I was also conducting a very quiet investigation into Brandon Hartwell and his family's business. You see, during my rise in the legal world, I had developed contacts in all sorts of industries: banking, automotive, real estate, insurance. When you're dealing with high-stakes business litigation, you learn to verify everything. And what I learned about the Hartwell family was very interesting indeed. On the surface, everything looked perfect. 5 successful dealerships, a beautiful home in Dublin, membership in all the right clubs. Brandon was charming, well-dressed, and seemed genuinely devoted to Jessica. But dig deeper, and cracks began to show. The dealerships were hemorrhaging money. The automotive industry was changing rapidly, and the Hartwells had been slow to adapt. They were over-leveraged on their real estate, behind on several loan payments, and facing serious cash flow problems. More importantly, Brandon wasn't the business genius my parents thought he was. He had a gambling problem that he'd managed to keep hidden from Jessica and his family. He owed money to some very unpleasant people, and he was growing desperate. But the most interesting discovery came when I was reviewing property records for an unrelated case. The Hartwell family's flagship dealership, the one that Brandon was supposed to inherit, sat on land that had been purchased by my grandfather in the 1940s. My grandfather had been a shrewd businessman who had bought up lots of cheap land around Columbus after World War II. When he died, he'd left everything to my grandmother. When she died, she'd left everything to my father, with a very specific provision. According to the will, if my father died without male heirs, the property would pass to his oldest child, not his oldest son, his oldest child. That would be me. My father had never bothered to read the will carefully. He'd assumed that since he had daughters, the property would just be sold and the proceeds divided. But the language was very specific, written by a lawyer who believed in women's rights long before it was fashionable. I owned the land under Brandon's future inheritance, and he had no idea. Jessica's wedding was 3 months away when the Hartwells' financial problems reached a crisis point. One of their dealerships had to close, and they were facing foreclosure on 2 others. Brandon's gambling debts had reached a dangerous level, and he was running out of places to hide. That's when he made a desperate decision. He came to see me at my office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March. My assistant announced him with surprise. I hadn't spoken to my future brother-in-law since the engagement party 2 years earlier. Brandon looked different. Still handsome, but there was a desperation in his eyes that hadn't been there before. His expensive suit was rumpled, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled. "Sarah," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Thank you for seeing me." "What can I do for you, Brandon?" I asked coolly. He shifted uncomfortably. I need your help. It's about the dealership." I leaned back in my chair. "I'm not sure how I can help with that. I don't know much about car sales." "It's not about sales," he said quickly. "It's about property law, real estate. I heard you're one of the best in the city. Flattery, how predictable. I need to understand some property rights," he continued. "The land under our main dealership. There's some confusion about the ownership, and we need to get it cleared up before we can refinance." I pretended to consider this. "That sounds like something you should take to a real estate attorney. I specialize in intellectual property." "Please," he said. And there it was, the first crack in his perfect facade. "You're family, almost family. And I heard you helped some automotive company with a big case. You understand the industry." I let the silence stretch between us before speaking. "I'll look into it, but I'll need all the relevant documents. Deeds, purchase agreements, financing papers, everything." Relief flooded his face. "Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate this. And maybe we don't need to mention this to Jessica or your parents? I don't want them to worry unnecessarily." I smiled. "Of course. Attorney-client privilege." Over the next few weeks, I reviewed every document Brandon provided. What he didn't know was that I already had copies of most of them from my own research. I was looking for something specific, and I found it. Hidden in the maze of corporate filings and property transfers was evidence of fraud. Brandon had been forging his father's signature on loan documents, using the dealership properties as collateral, without his father's knowledge. He was trying to secure enough money to pay off his gambling debts before anyone discovered what he'd done. But there was a problem. The main dealership, the one that generated most of their revenue, sat on my Land. Any loan secured against that property was invalid without my signature as the actual owner. Brandon had built his house of cards on a foundation he didn't own. I could have exposed him immediately. I could have called the police, had him arrested for fraud, and destroyed his life before he could say "I do" to my sister. But that would have been too easy. Too quick. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to be dismissed, to be considered worthless, to have everything you thought you were crumble around you. I wanted him to beg. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received an emergency call from Brandon. His voice was shaking with panic. "Sarah, we have a problem, a big problem. I was in my office, reviewing contracts for a new client, but I set everything aside." This was the moment I'd been waiting for. "What kind of problem?" I asked. "The bank. They're calling in our loans. All of them. They say there's an issue with the collateral, something about the property ownership. They want everything cleared up immediately or they're foreclosing." I made sympathetic noises. "That sounds serious. What do you need from me?" "I need that property report you've been working on. And I think we might need your signature on something. Some kind of ownership verification." My signature. Just like the title had promised. "Brandon, this is very complicated. Property law isn't something you rush into. One mistake could make things worse." I know. But the wedding is in 2 weeks. If this doesn't get resolved, we'll lose everything. The dealerships, the house, everything. I can't let Jessica find out about this. It would destroy her." Could hear the tears in his voice. This strong, confident man, who had dismissed me as too plain to matter, was falling apart. "Can you come to my office tomorrow?" I asked. "We need to discuss this in person." "Yes, absolutely. Sarah, I can't thank you enough. You're saving my life." After I hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the Columbus skyline, feeling a satisfaction I'd never experienced before. Tomorrow, the man who thought I wasn't worth 5 minutes of conversation at an engagement party would be begging for my help. Brandon arrived at my office the next morning, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usual confidence was completely gone, replaced by barely contained panic. "Please tell me you have good news," he said as soon as he sat down. I opened the thick folder I'd prepared and spread documents across my desk. "I have news. Whether it's good or bad depends on your perspective." His face went white. "What do you mean?" "Brandon, the property issue is more complicated than you realized. The land under your family's main dealership doesn't belong to your father." "What? That's impossible. We've owned that property for 20 years. You've had a lease on that property for 20 years. The actual ownership never transferred. It belongs to the estate of Robert Mitchell." "Who the hell is Robert Mitchell?" I smiled. "My grandfather." The silence in the room was deafening. I watched as understanding slowly dawned on Brandon's face. That means I own the land your business is built on. I own the collateral you've been using to secure loans. I own the foundation of everything you thought you had." Brandon's hands were shaking now. But your parents never said anything. Your father never... My father never bothered to read the will carefully. He assumed that since he didn't have sons, the property would just be sold. But my grandfather was more progressive than most men of his generation. He believed daughters were just as capable as sons. I leaned forward, enjoying the look of absolute terror on Brandon's face. "Here's what's really interesting, though. Those loan documents you've been signing, the ones where you used this property as collateral, those are fraudulent. You can't secure a loan against property you don't own." "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God. It gets better. I've reviewed your financial records, the ones you provided as part of your property research request. You forged your father's signature on several loan applications. That's a felony, Brandon." He looked like he was going to be sick. "What do you want?" "Excuse me?" "What do you want?" he repeated, his his voice barely audible. You must want something. Why else would you be telling me this instead of just turning me in? I pretended to consider the question. That's a fair point. What could you possibly offer me? Money. I mean, when this gets sorted out, when the business is back on track, I could pay you. A lot. I laughed. Brandon, you're broke. Your family is broke. You're facing criminal charges. What money? He was silent for a long moment, then looked up at me with something like hope in his eyes. You could help me. You could sign off on the property transfer, legitimize the loans, save the business. You're a lawyer. You could make this all go away. I could, I agreed. But why would I? Because... He struggled for words. Because we're going to be family. Because Jessica loves me. Because it's the right thing to do. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I'd built my success despite everything my family had said about me. Do you remember what my mother said at that Sunday dinner 6 months ago, Brandon? You were there. He looked confused. No, not really. She said I was too ugly to marry, too plain, too serious. She said men weren't looking for someone like me. Understanding flickered in his eyes. Sarah, I never said anything like that. You didn't have to. You made it clear enough at your engagement party. When I tried to tell you about my work, you couldn't get away from me fast enough. You were just dismissing me, just like everyone else in my family has done my entire life. I turned back to face him. Do you know what I've accomplished since then, Brandon? Do you know who I am now? He shook his head mutely. I'm one of the most successful intellectual property attorneys in the Midwest. I've won cases against Fortune 500 companies. I've made millions of dollars. I own property, businesses, investments. I've built an empire while you've been gambling yours away. The truth hit him like a physical blow. How did you know about the gambling? Brandon, I'm a lawyer. I investigate things for a living. Did you really think I wouldn't look into the man who was marrying my sister? He slumped in his chair, completely defeated. What do you want me to do? I returned to my desk and sat down. I want you to understand something. Right now, with one phone call, I could destroy your life. I could have you arrested for fraud. I could foreclose on your family's business. I could make sure you never work in this state again. Please, he whispered. Please don't do that. I'll do anything. Anything? He nodded desperately. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is a property transfer agreement. It officially transfers ownership of the land under your dealership from me to your father, legitimizing all those loans you've taken out. Hope flared in his eyes. You'll sign it? I might, but I have conditions. Name them. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. First, you're going to tell my parents and Jessica exactly who bailed you out. You're going to explain that their unmarriageable daughter saved your entire family from bankruptcy and criminal prosecution. He nodded quickly. Done. Absolutely. Second, you're going to make a public statement at your wedding, in front of all those successful, attractive couples my mother was worried about. You're going to tell them that without my help, there wouldn't be a wedding at all. Yes, whatever you want. Third, you're going to get help for your gambling addiction. Real help. Counseling. Gamblers Anonymous. Whatever it takes. Because if I ever find out you've put Jessica at financial risk again, I will destroy you. I promise. I swear. I picked up a pen and held it poised over the document. And finally, you're going to treat me with the respect I've earned. No more dismissive looks. No more changing the subject when I speak. No more acting like I'm some pathetic spinster who should be grateful for scraps of attention. Of course. Yes. Absolutely. I signed the document with a flourish and slid it across the desk. Brandon grabbed it like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. "Thank you," he breathed. "Sarah, I can't thank you enough. You saved my life." "Yes," I said calmly. "I did. Don't you forget it." The conversation with my parents happened 3 days later. Brandon had requested a family meeting, claiming he had something important to discuss before the wedding. We gathered in my parents' living room, the same room where my mother had told me I was too ugly to marry. Jessica sat next to Brandon on the couch, looking confused but radiant in her pre-wedding glow. My parents sat in their usual chairs, and I took the seat across from them. I hadn't told them about my financial success, my business, or anything else about my new life. I wanted them to hear it from Brandon. "There's something I need to tell you all," Brandon began, his voice shaking slightly. "Something about the business and about Sarah." My father frowned. "What about Sarah?" Brandon took a deep breath. "We've been having some financial difficulties. Serious ones. Bad enough that we were facing bankruptcy, possibly criminal charges." Jessica gasped. "Brandon, what are you talking about?" "I made some mistakes. Bad investments, bad decisions. We were going to lose everything, the dealerships, the house, everything." My mother looked horrified. "But the wedding—" "There wasn't going to be a wedding," Brandon interrupted. "We couldn't have afforded it. We were going to have to call everything off and declare bankruptcy." "But you didn't," my father said slowly. "So what changed?" Brandon looked directly at me. "Sarah saved us. All of us." The room went dead silent. "What do you mean?" my mother asked. "I mean that your daughter, the one you said was too plain to marry, too serious to be interesting, is one of the most successful lawyers in Columbus. She owns property worth millions of dollars. She runs a law firm that handles cases for Fortune 500 companies. And when I was desperate and had nowhere else to turn, she saved my family from complete destruction." Jessica's mouth was hanging open. "Sarah? But you never said— you never told us." I shrugged. "You never asked. You were all too busy planning the perfect wedding for the perfect daughter." My mother looked like she'd been slapped. "But your little office, your small cases." "My little office employs 12 people and generated over $3 million in revenue last year. My small cases include a $50 million verdict that made national news," Brandon continued, his voice gaining strength. "The land under our main dealership, the foundation of our entire business, belongs to Sarah, has belonged to her for years. She could have foreclosed on us, had me arrested, destroyed everything. Instead, she chose to help us." "Why?" my father asked, his voice barely audible. I stood up, looking down at these people who had spent my entire life making me feel small and worthless. "Because despite everything you've said about me, despite every cruel comment and dismissive look, despite being told I was too ugly to matter, I'm still a better person than any of you gave me credit for." My mother started to cry. "Sarah, honey, we never meant—" "Yes, you did. You meant every word. You wanted me to know my place, to accept that I was less than Jessica, less than what you wanted in a daughter." "We were wrong," my father said quietly. "We were so wrong." "Yes, you were. But here's the thing. Your opinion of me stopped mattering a long time ago. I didn't save Brandon's business for you. I didn't do it for your approval or your apologies. I did it because Jessica loves him. And despite everything, I love Jessica." I gathered my purse and headed for the door. "The wedding is in 4 days. I'll be there in whatever seat you assign me. And Brandon will make his announcement to all those attractive couples you were so worried about embarrassing yourselves in front of." Jessica's wedding was everything my mother had dreamed of. The church was decorated with white roses and baby's breath. The bride looked like a princess in her flowing gown, and the guest list was indeed filled with the cream of Columbus society. wore a stunning emerald green dress that cost more than my parents' mortgage payment, and felt more confident than I ever had in my life. I sat in the front row. Jessica had insisted, despite my parents' initial protests. The ceremony was beautiful. Jessica was radiant. Brandon was handsome and nervous, and when they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. But the real moment came during the reception. Brandon stood up during the toasts, champagne glass in hand, and asked for everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this incredible day with Jessica and me," he began. "But before we go any further, I need to acknowledge someone who made this day possible." He turned to look directly at me. 6 months ago, Jessica's sister Sarah saved my life. Not metaphorically, literally. My family was facing financial ruin, and I was staring down bankruptcy and possible criminal charges. I was too proud and too ashamed to ask for help, but Sarah saw what was happening and stepped in. The room was completely silent, hanging on every word. Sarah is one of the most successful attorneys in Ohio. She's won cases against some of the biggest corporations in America. She owns property and businesses worth millions of dollars. And when I needed help, when my family needed help, she didn't hesitate. He raised his glass toward me. "Sarah, you saved our family. You made this wedding possible. You made our future possible. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you gave us." The applause was thunderous. People I'd never met were looking at me with new respect, with curiosity, with admiration. My parents sat at their table looking stunned, while Jessica beamed at me with tears in her eyes. After the toast, person after person approached me, wanting to know about my work, my success, my story. I was surrounded by the same attractive couples. My mother had been worried about embarrassing herself in front of, and they were all fascinated by me. "I had no idea Jessica's sister was the Sarah Mitchell who won that huge patent case," one woman said. "That was brilliant work." "I read about your firm in the business journal," a man added. "Very impressive. Are you taking new clients?" For the first time in my life, I was the center of attention at a family event, not as an object of pity or dismissal, but as someone to be admired and respected. The weeks following the wedding brought changes I hadn't expected. My parents called regularly, wanting to have lunch, to talk, to somehow repair the damage they'd done. Jessica reached out constantly, full of apologies and questions about my life that she'd never bothered to ask before. I didn't cut them off entirely, but I also didn't make it easy. Relationships that had been broken for decades couldn't be fixed, with a few conversations over coffee. My mother struggled the most with the new dynamic. She'd spent so many years seeing me as the disappointing daughter that she didn't know how to relate to me as a successful adult. "I don't understand how we didn't know," she said during one particularly difficult conversation. "How could we have been so blind?" "You saw what you wanted to see," I replied. "It was easier to dismiss me than to acknowledge that maybe your values were wrong." Jessica, to her credit, made the most effort to rebuild our relationship. She and Brandon moved to a smaller house while they worked to rebuild the family business, and she often stopped by my office just to talk. "I'm ashamed," she told me during one of these visits. "I'm ashamed that I let them treat you that way. I'm ashamed that I never stood up for you." "You were young," I said, "and you were getting everything you wanted. It's hard to question a system that's working for you. That's no excuse. You're my sister. I should have been better." Brandon kept his promises. He got help for his gambling addiction, worked harder than he ever had in his life to rebuild the business, and treated me with a respect that bordered on reverence. He never forgot that I could have destroyed him and chose mercy instead. A year after the wedding, my life had settled into a new rhythm. My law firm was thriving, handling high-profile cases across the Midwest. I'd been featured on the cover of Columbus Business Magazine as one of the city's power players under 40. I'd bought a beautiful house in the countryside outside Columbus, complete with a library that would have made my teenage self weep with joy. But the biggest change wasn't professional. It was personal. His name was David Chen, and he was nothing like what my parents would have chosen for me. He was a brilliant engineer who had developed several of the patents I'd helped protect. A quiet man who valued intelligence over appearance and substance over status. We met during a consultation about his latest invention, a breakthrough in renewable energy storage that could revolutionize the industry. "You're the Sarah Mitchell," he said when we first shook hands. "I followed your work for years. That automotive safety case was masterful." For the first time in my life, a man was impressed by my mind before he even noticed what I looked like. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared interests. David didn't care that I wasn't conventionally beautiful by my mother's standards. He saw me as I truly was, intelligent, successful, and worthy of love. When I brought him to a family dinner 8 months after we started dating, my parents were polite but clearly confused. David wasn't the wealthy, socially connected type they'd always imagined for their daughters. He was soft-spoken, wore simple clothes, and talked passionately about sustainable technology rather than golf scores or stock portfolios. But Jessica loved him immediately. "He looks at you the way Brandon looks at me," she whispered to me in the kitchen. "Like you're the most fascinating person in the world." My mother, still struggling to adjust to the new reality of who I was, made an effort. "He seems nice," she said carefully. "He is nice," I replied. "He's also brilliant, kind, and he loves me for exactly who I am." David proposed on a quiet Sunday morning in my library, surrounded by all the books that had been my refuge during those lonely years. He didn't get down on one knee or make a grand gesture. Instead, he simply took my hand while we were reading together and said, "Sarah, I want to spend the rest of my life having conversations like this with you." The ring was perfect. Not the enormous diamond Jessica had received, but a stunning sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds, chosen because he knew I preferred unique beauty over conventional showiness. When I called to tell my family the news, there was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "That's wonderful, honey," my mother finally said, and I could hear the genuine happiness in her voice. "When's the wedding?" "We're thinking of something small," I said. "Just close family and friends." "Whatever makes you happy," my father added, and for the first time in my life I believed he meant it. The wedding was everything I'd ever wanted. Intimate, meaningful, and entirely our own. We held it in the garden of my country house, with 50 guests who were there because they truly cared about us, not because they needed to be seen at the right social events. Jessica was my matron of honor, finally getting the chance to support me the way a sister should. Brandon, now genuinely humble and grateful, walked me down the aisle since my father was recovering from minor surgery. As I stood there in my simple but elegant dress, looking into David's eyes while we exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, I thought about how far I'd traveled from that humiliated woman sitting at my parents' dinner table 2 years earlier. My mother cried during the ceremony, not tears of disappointment or concern about appearances, but tears of joy for a daughter she was finally beginning to understand. During the reception, Professor Martinez, who had become like a second mother to me, raised her glass for a toast. "I've known Sarah for over a decade," she said, "and I've watched her grow from a brilliant student into an extraordinary woman. She's shown us all that success isn't about meeting other people's expectations. It's about exceeding your own." As the evening wound down and David and I prepared to leave, for our honeymoon in Italy, my mother pulled me aside. "Sarah," she said, tears in her eyes, "I owe you an apology that's about 10 years overdue." "Mom, no, let me say this. I was wrong about everything. About what makes a person valuable. About what makes someone worthy of love. About what success looks like. You've accomplished more than I ever dreamed possible, and you've done it while maintaining your integrity and kindness. I'm proud of you. I should have been proud of you all along. I hugged her then, really hugged her, for the first time in years. Thank you, I whispered. That means more than you know. Today, I'm sitting in my office overlooking downtown Columbus, preparing for another high-profile case that could set precedent for intellectual property law nationwide. My firm now employs 23 people, and we've expanded to include offices in Cleveland and Cincinnati. David and I have been married for 3 years, and our daughter Emma just turned 1. She has her father's gentle nature, and what I like to think is my determination. When I look at her, I promise myself that she'll never feel the way I felt growing up. That she'll know she's valued for her mind, her character, and her unique gifts, whatever they turn out to be. Jessica and Brandon are doing well. The dealership business recovered and is now thriving under Brandon's more cautious but dedicated management. They have a son now, and Jessica has become an advocate for women in business, partly inspired by my example. My parents have become different people, or maybe they've just become the people they always had the potential to be. They adore their granddaughter and treat David with genuine warmth and respect. My mother volunteers at a literacy program, and my father has started mentoring young entrepreneurs. Last month, I was invited to speak at Ohio State University's law school graduation. As I stood at the podium, looking out at all those bright young faces, I thought about the scared, insecure girl I once was. Some of you may feel like you don't fit the traditional mold of success, I told them. You may have been told you're too quiet, too serious, too different. I'm here to tell you that those differences aren't limitations. They're your strengths. The world doesn't need another copy of someone else. It needs the first you. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me, quiet, serious, wearing thick glasses and a slightly ill-fitting suit that reminded me of myself at that age. Ms. Mitchell, she said shyly, I just wanted to thank you. Your story, it gives me hope. What's your name? I asked. Rachel Thompson. Rachel, I said, shaking her hand firmly. The world has no idea what you're capable of yet, but they will. As I watched her walk away with new confidence in her step, I thought about how the cruelest words my parents ever spoke to me, calling me too ugly to marry, had ultimately led to this moment. Their dismissal had driven me to prove them wrong, to build something extraordinary, to find love on my own terms, and to create a life that exceeded every expectation. Sometimes the greatest gift people can give you is their low opinion of you. It forces you to reach higher than you ever thought possible. Brandon never forgot that lesson either. Every year on my birthday, he sends me a card with the same simple message. Thank you for your signature on my life. And that, everyone, is my story. It was a wild ride, but I wouldn't change how it ended. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? I'm really curious to know, so tell me down in the comments below. Have you ever experienced anything remotely similar? Or had a moment where you just knew you had to take a stand? I'd love to read your experiences if you're comfortable sharing. If you found this story satisfying and you're hungry for more, please do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss out on the next one. Thanks for listening.